Alright y'all, so we are at my EM2. In part 1, we had got the swap in there. It was still up in the air. We didn't have the wheels on it. We didn't have a full exhaust on it. It was just an open header. But as you can see, she is on the ground, has a full exhaust. We have both wheels on there. Everything's done. She's fully tuned. She's running real good, running real strong. In this video, we're kind of just going to start at the front of the car and work our way back so I can show you guys more in detail of all the things you need to know in order to K-swap an EM2 or any 7th-gen Civic, ES1, ES2, and so forth. So we're going to start right here, and I'm going to give you guys some info. So I missed this in part 1, the radiator. Don't know how I missed it, but we're going to go over that right now. So in my swap right now, I'm running a 2-row eBay RSX radiator. Nothing fancy. It has 2 slim fans on it. I just wired them together so that way when the fan switch cuts on, both of the fans cut on. You can see them right here, and then the one on this side. They're pretty tucked in there, so it's a little hard to see on camera. But yeah, the RSX radiator works. This is, like I said, just from eBay. But you can use an OEM RSX radiator. You can use an EP3 radiator, or you can use a 01 to 05 Civic hybrid radiator. I believe you can still use the factory radiator that comes in the EM2 or the 7th-gen Civic. You just have to run your hoses different, but to me it's not worth the trouble. So it's easier just to swap it, like I said, from an RSX or an EP3 or an 01 to 05 Civic hybrid. If you do run the OEM RSX radiator, you cannot use the OEM fans with it. You have to run slim fans, because if you decide to run the OEM fans, you have to cut this out. This right here is this little support beam. It runs all the way down to the bottom of the car, but you have to cut this out if you decide to run the OEM fans with the OEM RSX radiator, because it won't fit. But if you get the eBay one with the slim fans, or the OEM one with slim fans, it'll drop right in. This one was a little snug. I had to kind of work it down in there, but I got it. And I just used the factory brackets from the EM2 to just bolt it up and hold it in place. So works just fine. But any one of those radiators will work. So the next thing is the coolant hoses. So for your coolant hoses, this top one is from a base RSX I just picked up from the junkyard. Nothing fancy. And the bottom one, probably not gonna be able to see it on camera, but I'm running the stock TSX lower radiator hose with the stock K24 thermostat. So with the K24 swaps in the EM2, I know a lot of people run the swivel style thermostat. I've just seen and heard a lot of things with those. They tend to leak all the time. So I just went with the stock K24 one, and it works perfectly fine with the TSX lower hose. So you don't have to get all fancy with that. For the top one, RSX hose, bottom one, TSX with the stock K24 thermostat, and it works fine. Another thing with this radiator is that it has a spot for the fan switch on the bottom. That little like brown kind of looking thing at the bottom. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the fan switch right there. Now, a couple things with that. So if you're running Kpro, you don't have to leave that fan switch plugged in. Kpro actually gets its readings from this sensor right here. So you don't have to have the fan switch plugged up. One of the issues I ran into when I left that plugged in is that when I would turn my key to accessory, the fans would cut on automatically. It didn't matter if the car was cold, hot, whatever, the fans would constantly just kick on. So just after a bunch of research and looking into it, I realized that since I am running Kpro, I can leave that fan switch plug and the radiator just unplugged. So now when I turn my key forward, the fans don't cut on until the temperature I have set in Kpro. So that's only if you're running Kpro. Only if you're running Kpro, you don't have to have that plugged in. Now, if you're running the stock ECU, this harness, which is the Jack Spania K20 tuck harness that I mentioned in part 1, this harness comes with the fan switch wire, so you just plug it in to the sensor. But most K20 harnesses don't come with that fan switch wire. So if you're running a stock K20 fan switch, you have to wire it in to the bottom of the fuse box. I have mine bolted in right now, so I can't show you guys, but on the bottom of this, it's a green and white wire. I'll try to put a picture of it on the screen so you guys can see what I'm talking about. But yeah, so Kpro, leave the fan switch and the radiator unplugged. Stock ECU, you're gonna have to either plug in the fan switch or wire the fan switch into the fuse box on the EM2 or 7th Gen Civic or whatever you guys are working on. So just keep that in mind. So the next thing, like I mentioned in part 1, this is a K24A2 from a 2004 Acura TSX paired with a 5-speed manual transmission from a 2003 Honda Accord. So since I'm running the K24 transmission, you have to use the ESK4 kit either from Hasport or Jack Spania, or whoever makes an ESK4 kit for a K24 transmission. If you're running the K20 transmission, you have to run the ESK3 kit from Hasport, or you have to run, I believe, Innovative Mounts, or someone that makes an ESK3 kit or some type of kit to use with a K20 transmission. Just keep that in mind when you're doing this swap. So another thing that I kind of talked about in part 1, I just want to clarify, power steering. You don't have to run the electric power steering from the EP3 or the Civic Hybrid. This is from a base RSX. All of this, the lines and everything are from a base RSX. They go right in the stock location on the 7th Gen Civics. Once you have those in, you can run the base RSX pump, no problem. It bolts up just fine, works perfectly fine with the K24. Haven't had any issues with it, so yeah. Another thing I want to touch on is the throttle body. Like I mentioned in part 1, this is from a 2003 Honda Accord. This is the easiest bolt-on option if you don't want to run a K20 or don't have access to one. This one bolts right on perfectly fine. If you run the K20 throttle body, you have to get the adapter plate that goes on the manifold in order to run it. Or you can run like a Type S manifold with the K20 throttle body. It all works. There's just different stuff you have to do. But if you stay with the stock K24 manifold, the 2003, I'm not sure to when, but I know this throttle body came from a 2003 Honda Accord that's drive-by cable, and it fits on the manifold just fine. So just keep that in mind. So another thing that I didn't mention in part 1 is the exhaust setup. So currently we have a full exhaust on our K24 swap. It goes all the way to the back of the car. We just had an open header in part 1. But, so I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a tip that probably no one has mentioned. Now, as far as the exhaust, this is the stock TSX header with a custom downpipe to my exhaust. Now, I know a lot of people will tell you that you can't run the K24 header and downpipe because it doesn't clear the like the sway bar and everything. This is the stock sway bar from the EM2 with the TSX header, and it fits perfectly fine. Everything clears. So what we had to do is we had to go to an exhaust shop and we brought them the TSX downpipe. They cut it at the flange on top and just welded a custom downpipe to connect to the exhaust under the car. Now, a lot of people will say that you have to run the K20 header and downpipe from an RSX or EP3 because of clearance issues, but even when you go that route, you still have to take it to an exhaust shop and get them to weld it up under the car. Or if you decide to run swap headers, you still have to take it to an exhaust shop and get them to weld it up under the car. So I figured, since I already had the TSX header and downpipe, if it has to get welded up either way, why not just use the K24 stuff? Also, the K24 header and downpipe is a lot bigger than the K20, so I just feel like it helps the engine breathe a little bit better, but it fits perfectly fine. You can see part of the downpipe right there, the silver pipe. We have our wideband sensor in there going inside the car. I'll show you guys that once we get in there. But yeah, this is all K24 exhaust. It fits perfectly fine on the EM2. You can run the stock sway bar, and you won't have any clearance issues. So just wanted to give you guys that tip, because I know a lot of people, like I said, say you have to go with the K20 stuff. The K24 stuff works perfectly fine, no issue. So just keep that in mind. So now we're going to get into a little bit of how it's actually hooked up, all the hoses and everything, some of the wiring in the engine bay. So it's pretty straightforward. My wiring harness is kind of all over the place because we've been doing a lot of just small repairs and fixing stuff. So we're going to start, I guess, right here. So this line right here, if you decide to keep this hardware on the side, these metal lines, this goes from the brake booster to this hose that's sticking up right here. This hose runs down this top metal tube and goes to the manifold in the front. If you wanted to get rid of these like hard lines right here, you could just run a hose from your brake booster all the way to the front. I just haven't done it because I don't have any hose that's long enough. So I just have it like this for now, but I'll probably change that in the future just to tuck it away, make it a little cleaner. You'll notice on the bottom part, there's another hard line. So this originally right here connected to the throttle body, but I just have that capped off. You don't need this bottom one. I think originally on the K24, it was an evap line. And then I also have it capped in the back right here. Really, you could leave this whole line uncapped because it doesn't connect anywhere. It's not going to make a vacuum leak, but I just threw those on there just to, you know, I guess be safe. But I will tell you guys this. So if you look right here on the firewall, this is the mistake I made when I first put the swap in the car. So right here is your fuel line, and right here is another hard line that comes out of the firewall. This is the breather hose for the gas tank that lets the fumes out so the fuel tank doesn't build up pressure. Now the mistake I made with this one is that I connected this to this bottom port right here, and then I had the hose run from here to the throttle body. The problem with that is that every time I would get gas, the fumes from the gas tank would travel through here into the throttle body, and it would make the car like hard start pretty much. I'd have to crank the car like 2 and 3 times. Because when all those fumes get into the throttle body, it pretty much floods the engine. And every time I would get gassed, I'd have to crank it and crank it, keep my foot on the gas to clear all that, you know, gas out of the manifold. So I just decided to take this line off, and ever since then, I haven't had any problems with it. When I get gas now, it cranks up just fine. So you can put like a little filter on this or just let it vent to atmosphere. It won't smell like gas or anything. You'll be perfectly fine. But just a little tip I discovered, don't connect this to anything because you'll have problems. With the fuel line, on this end, this is just the factory D17 connection up here. And on this end to the fuel rail, this is from the K24. They're different sizes. The D17 one won't fit up here, and the K24 one won't fit back here. So keep this D17, and this connection up here is K24, and you'll be perfectly fine. I think I touched on this in part 1. The throttle cable, this is from a 2003 Honda Accord. It's a lot shorter than the D17 one. You can use the D17 throttle cable, but it'll come out the firewall and wrap all the way around the engine bay and then to the throttle body. The Accord one, you have to drill a hole right here, and then it'll bolt up on the inside, just connect it to the gas pedal, and it'll run straight out of there, and you can put it right on the throttle body. This bracket also comes from an Accord. If you're running the stock K24 manifold, the Accord throttle cable bracket will bolt right onto it perfectly fine. So that's what we have holding it on there, and it works perfectly fine. One last thing that I did not mention in part 1 is the fuse box. So with the fuse box, how I have this set up, on the right side, this one goes straight from here to the alternator, right here where my finger is. I just have it ran right there. That little bolt is. Goes from the fuse box to that, where that little bolt is right there. This goes from the left side and runs all the way back straight to the battery. I'll show you guys that when we get back there. But I know like this was confusing for me when I went to go actually, you know, wire up the power for the car, but this is how it looks under the fuse box. One more thing. So when you're doing this swap, your ground wires, you want to make sure you have enough ground wires, because if you don't, you could fry your ECU or something could go wrong. So I'm gonna show you guys the ground wires real quick. So my first ground wire that I have is right here. So where this stud is, under here, I have a ground wire, which is this right here that connects to the shock tower. That's my first one. I also have my ECU ground from the harness on this one, and it works perfectly fine. My next ground wire is from this water, I guess this water pipe. It carries coolant through here. I have it from right here, and it goes to the body right there. I just sanded it. That's my second ground. And then I have another ground that goes from the front of the transmission right here. It goes from right there. And I have it on the body, like on the outside. I'm probably not gonna be able to get it because the wheel is in the way, but it just goes to the frame on the outside. Just sand a spot down and you'll be good to go. But that's pretty much it for the engine bay. I went over a lot in part 1, so if there's anything I missed, I may have mentioned it in part 1. If you guys have any questions about the engine bay, just drop it in the comments below and I'll try my best to answer it. But I think that's pretty much everything. So now we're gonna move to the inside of the car. So we're on the inside of the car now. I figured while we're gonna be in here, I'll give you guys a little tour of some of the stuff that we've done. So as you can see, I got EP3 seats in here. I got these from the junkyard the same day I got the subframe for the Kswap. It's really rare that you see an EP3 in the junkyard, and I'm surprised the seats were still in there, so I had to get these. They're a little dirty right now because I got to vacuum out my car, but we got the EP3 seats in here. I redid the fabric on the doors to this red. Redid the headliner in this red fabric. Another thing that I did is I did a rear seat delete. It's kind of messy back there right now. I still got to clean it up a little bit, but you know, it's a race car, so we got rid of the back seats. I have a Mugen shift boot cover. This actually came from a D16, but I made it just fit on here and it works perfectly fine. And then yeah, of course, this is the Honda Accord shifter, like I mentioned in part 1. But this time it's actually connected to the transmission. I know in part 1 I didn't have it all connected, but you can hear it go into gear. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and reverse. It works perfectly fine. So, and then the biggest thing, I did the RSX gauge cluster swap. This is all from a base RSX. Wired it up, everything works. I'll show you guys real quick. And then of course I have my wideband gauge. I have a little bit of how I hooked this up on Instagram. If you guys want to check that out, it's in my highlights under the Kswap one, but everything works on the gauge cluster. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We're about to put a quick release wheel on here, probably in a later video. I already have it. We're just waiting for another part to come in, and then we're gonna swap this out, get rid of this big ass boat wheel. But yeah, so that's enough with the interior tour. We're gonna jump into all the wiring and stuff to get everything to work in the EM2. This was a huge part that I missed in part 1, so I do apologize for that. But this is probably one of the most important parts. So this is my ECU right here. I just have it tucked where the radio would be. Probably gonna leave it in there. I plan on getting like an Apple CarPlay, so it's flat, it'll fit on here. But anyway, so this is Kpro V4. That's the type of ECU I'm running. All the connectors off of the Jack Spanier harness plug right in, no problem. You plug it in just like you would with like a stock ECU. It's the same exact thing. There's a couple things that you have to do in order to get everything to work in your 7th gen Civic. So the first thing is the vehicle speed sensor. That was pretty much the only thing I had an issue with when I was doing this swap. I couldn't get the speedometer to work on the cluster, and I couldn't get it to work in Kpro on my laptop. Now, how I fixed that is, I don't know if this pertains to every like Kpro ECU or if it's just this one. I believe this is a PPA out of a automatic CRV. Originally, the problem I had at first was that the car wasn't seeing any speed at all. It wasn't reading speed on my laptop in Kpro. It wasn't showing up on the dash, and my VTEC wasn't working. So just in case you guys don't know, your VTEC kind of works off of your vehicle speed sensor. If your vehicle speed sensor isn't working, you can't go into VTEC, which is the problem I had. Every time I would hit my VTEC engagement point, the car would pretty much go into safe mode because it wasn't like reading my vehicle speed sensor correct. So what I had to do is I had to wire the output from my vehicle speed sensor into Kpro. You can kind of see that it's this red wire right here that goes directly into Kpro. So once I did that, I could see my speed in Kpro. I had to select the alternate input in order for it to work and like actually show in my Kpro. The countershaft option didn't work. I forgot what the other option was, but that doesn't work either. I had to select the alternate one, and then my VTEC started working. So then the next problem was that even though it was showing on Kpro, it still wasn't showing on the dash. So how I fixed that was I had to get a vehicle speed sensor converter. I'll show you guys that here. So this is from Ktune. I picked this up on Marketplace. So what this does is it pretty much alters the signal so it'll show up on your gauge cluster. Now I believe the K24 vehicle speed sensor is a high output sensor, and the input on the gauge cluster in the EM2 and RSX is a low input. So what this does is it takes the signal from the vehicle speed sensor and it converts it so it'll work on the cluster. Pretty much there's 4 wires that come off of this. There's a red wire, a black wire, a white wire, and a blue wire. So your red wire you want to have hooked up to like a 12-volt power source that comes on when your key is turned. So I have the power for that ran to the cigarette lighter. So that way when you turn the key, the sensor comes on. The black wire off of that is for a ground. I just have that grounded to the cigarette lighter too. A lot of people wire this into the actual harness, but I didn't want to, you know, damage the harness or anything, so I just wired it to this for power. There's a white wire on that too, which is the vehicle speed sensor. I believe that's the input. The input wire, you want to wire to the same wire you have going into your Kpro. So this red wire and the white wire off of the converter are tied together. Now the blue wire on here is for the output. The blue wire is what goes into the actual like gauge cluster. Well, it's wired to the input for the gauge cluster, if that makes sense. You also need a C101 connector for this swap. I got mine from Ktune. I'll show you guys what that looks like on the screen. But that pretty much converts the K20 harness to be usable with the car side of the EM2 harness. It's pretty much plug and play. I hope that makes sense. If you guys have any questions about that, just drop them in the comments below. Now, of course, if you don't, care about it working on the, on the dash, you don't have to get the vehicle speed sensor. As long as it works in Kpro, your VTEC will work perfectly fine. I didn't have that sensor for the longest time. I was still hitting VTEC. I just couldn't see how fast I was going when I looked at the dash. So just keep that in mind. That's pretty much it on the car side. So Now we're gonna work our way back to the battery, and I'll show you guys more in detail how that's hooked up. I know we kind of went over that in part 1, but I'll just give you guys some more clarity on how that's hooked up. So let's go to the back. All right, y'all, so we're gonna get into this. So this is where my battery is now. So with this swap, you can pretty much move the battery anywhere. I've seen people move it like to the front bumper, they'll move it inside the car in the back. I just decided to move it in the trunk to keep it out the way. So I just have it in this battery box, and I have these little like hose fittings in there so the battery doesn't move around. So we're gonna go over this real quick. I kind of touched on this in part 1, but I'll go over it again just so you guys, well, just so it makes sense to you guys and there's no confusion. So this is my negative terminal. I have this one just going to the body right here. I just sanded this off and put a bolt through it with a nut on the back, and it's on there. So now for the positive, we try to keep this as stock as possible. When the battery was up front, it had 2 leads coming off of it. So I just kept it just like that and just basically extended the wire. So this wire right here, and it doesn't matter like which side you put them on. So this wire right here I have running to this circuit breaker. It's a 150 amp circuit breaker that I got from AutoZone. The reason why I have this is just because, well, it's just in case if one of these wires like shorts out or something, this will pop and it'll kind of save like some of the electronics in the car. So yeah, it goes to this circuit breaker, and then off of the circuit breaker, this goes directly to the starter up in the front. I can't really show you guys that because the wire is tucked up front. But yeah, it goes straight to the starter. And then this one right here comes directly off of here. It comes through this panel. I believe I showed this in part 1. It comes through here and runs through here. And then I have it just tucked up through this little hole that the door wires come from. It comes out of there and it goes through the fender and it runs along in here, and then it goes to the fuse box. So the one that doesn't go to the starter comes on the left hand side on the fuse box, and that's pretty much how the battery is ran. There's really not much to it, pretty straightforward. There's a couple ways you can like run power through it. I know some people, they connect the alternator and the starter together, like they just daisy chain it and then run it to the fuse box. But doing it that way, I just didn't understand it. I just kept it, like I said, as stock as possible because that's what made sense to me. But having it this way, haven't had any issues. It starts up fine, voltage is fine, and yeah, it's good to go. So you can do it pretty much any way you want to. I'm just showing you guys how I did it and what works for me. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the battery. All right, guys, so that's pretty much everything I have for y'all. I tried to go over as much as possible with all the stuff that I missed in part 1. But if you guys still have any questions, concerns, comments, just drop it down below and I'll get to it ASAP. But for right now, that's pretty much all I got. So I'll catch you guys on the next one.